All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for that mix-up in the beginning. Just a quick, well, first of all, welcome to you all. Thanks for giving us your time to attend this webinar. Just to quickly say that the webinar will be recorded and will be made available later on our website. I'm delighted that we are joined by Dr. Yousif Hassan from the School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan-Ann Arbor, who is going to be talking about, critically examining the AI for development discourses amid a lot of the techno-solutionist and techno-determinist discourses around AI in Africa. This webinar is being hosted by the EthicsLab, which is a research platform based at the University of Cape Town, which broadly looks to foster um, critical conversations about how the African humanities could inform the ethical questions posed by new and emerging technologies like AI, but also not limited to artificial intelligence. So, Yousif, welcome. Just to
All right.
tell everyone that, let everyone know as well that you'll be speaking for roughly 40 minutes, and then we'll use the remaining 40 minutes to open up the discussion to question and answer. And before I hand over to you, I'd just like to encourage everyone to please mute themselves, because I think we can hear someone talking in the background, but I'll just do that as well on my end. Um, Yeah, and I will put on I'll share in the chat room a link to our website. There's a call for expressions of interest there, just to say that we at the Ethics Lab are always looking and excited to connect with scholars who are roughly interested in how Africa, whether they're engaging with Africa empirically, conceptually, or theoretically, could inform the ethics of emerging technology. So we're glad that we have Yousif here with us, but we're also very excited to connect with other people who share similar interests as well. So Yousif, thank you, and over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Annie. And yeah, I'm very pleased to be here with you all today. I would like to thank the Ethics Lab at the University of Cape Town and the entire team for actually inviting me to give this talk as part of their webinar series. And thank you for all the attendees today for your interest. In the talk today, I will try to address the development of responsible AI and the emerging area of AI for development, also known as AI for D. And I will be arguing for an understanding of the debate surrounding this area as part of the larger debate about the contested visions of what a modern state building in Africa looks like using science and technology and innovation. So if you can move to the next slide. What I will be covering today, this is just a quick roadmap. I'll do a quick intro just to show the importance of this research. I will outlining my overarching research question, and then I will introduce my argument. And I will talk a little bit about the theoretical literature that I'm relying on for this project. And I'll discuss briefly a case study of development of AI for development in Kenya and Ghana. And then we'll talk about responsible AI and AI governance in terms of theory and practice in the continent, and share my research findings and their implications for theory and policy. So if you can go to the next one. So development seems to be in crisis, not only in the majority world or the global south or Africa in particular, but also in the West or the global north. So, for example, poverty rates for most international assistance receiving countries have increased since 2019, leaving between 20 to 70% of the population living under the poverty line. And globally, the situation is not very encouraging. The number of people living in extreme poverty has increased in 2023 to more than 700 million people around the world, according to the World Bank. If you go to the next slide. And as you can see from the graph here, extreme poverty is rising at an alarming rate, particularly in Africa. So this graph shows, I guess, the rate in sub-Saharan Africa, and also in East Africa and in North Africa and the Middle East as well. And this graph actually shows the terrible development outcomes and demonstrates the ineffectiveness of international development. So the latest 2023 UN SDG progress report shows that the progress has been insufficient or has gone into reverse on more than 50% of the SDG targets, such as poverty, hunger, and the climate. And the report sounds an alarming bell that half of the world is being left behind in development, where the majority of those who are left behind, as you might have guessed it, actually live in the South. So if you go next. And to put things in perspective, official development assistance totaled $223.7 billion in 2023, according to numbers from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And this figure actually shows an increase from previous years, but it still represents only 0.37 of the combined gross national income of development assistance committee member countries. And these figures also reflect, especially the ones from last year, reflect an increase from $211 billion in 2022 as a result of the aid flows to Ukraine and some of the other humanitarian crises, I guess, around some of the developing countries. So if you go to the next one. So against this backdrop of struggling development agenda, artificial intelligence is framed as an effective tool for expediting development goals and targets, and effectively deal with the broken model of international development. New programs of AI for development has been deployed by international development agencies and local partners across several African countries in sub-Saharan and West Africa, among many other places in the continent. And obviously, this seems like a logical and worthwhile undertaking, given the global hype around AI. However, lost in this debate is the very fundamental question of what is development. And this slide here just shows some of the, areas where responsible AI is being deployed in the continent currently. So if you go next. So I guess the main question is really like, what is development? And since the Paris Declaration on International Development and Aid Effectiveness by members of the OECD and the Accra Agenda for Action in 2008, a lot of efforts and energy are spent on improving development models toward more ownership, harmonization, and alignment. And on the surface, this looks like a significant departure from the old conventional wisdom in development economics that see development can only happen in the global south through domestic industrialization or international trade. However, critics of development ownership points out that this model of development in practice perpetuates the central role of multilateral organizations and international development donors in African development, while affording very little autonomy for local partners because of the increased pragmatism and self-interest of development actors, which render the implementation of this model ineffective. If we go next. So the central question for my talk today is, can responsible AI fix development in Africa? And there is an underlying assumption here, which is basically, if we fix AI governance in Africa, we can use AI responsibly to deal with some of the critical socioeconomic issues in the continent. But what is responsible AI? And just like development, it's a very highly contested term, and there are many understandings for what it means. But for our purpose today, I will go with a definition from a recent edited volume on the topic by Damien Ike and his colleagues at the De Montfort University in the UK, where they defined responsible AI as the idea of developing AI systems that will not only be compliant to laws such as human rights and other regulations, but are also socially and culturally sensitive and acceptable, as well as being ethically responsible, right? So there is an emphasis on, I guess, situatedness and understanding the context of where like AI solutions are actually being deployed. So my main argument, responsible AI initiatives in Africa are actually underpinned by a deficit model in development. And this deficit logic frames the failure of development in the majority world as an imminent consequence of the lack of human and technological capacity. And as we go through the presentation, I'll try to, obviously defend this argument. Um, so I use, like I'll talk a little bit about the analytical and theoretical framework. So I use the analytical lens of sociotechnical imaginaries to examine how the political cultures shape the understanding of the risk and benefits of technology, and to what degree these visions and ideas actually influence the fundamental ethical questions underpinning these technologies. And sociotechnical imaginaries framework can be defined as collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of advances in science and technology. So in another way, what this means, it means that this framework looks at how the future visions of technoscience shape and are shaped also by institutions in the modern state. And this framework has been mobilized in many areas, including studies of smart cities, energy transitions, emerging tech such as the fourth industrial revolution, and numerous ICT deployments. Um, and more to basically, use to understand the political dimensions of technological development and innovation. However, this concept does not address two important aspects. It lacks the required consideration of the economic environment and the racialized social structures of the epistemic communities in which science and technology and innovation are actually produced. And as a result, it lacks the understanding of the exclusion of the marginalized and underrepresented social groups from dominant sociotechnical imaginaries. So I try to look at the political economy of technoscience as well, and the political economy examines the ethical, social, and political dimensions of AI innovation economies and how they are actually constituted, organized, and configured by AI practices, and in turn, how AI node production is actually shaped by these economic practices. And most of this literature view issues of AI governance, such as algorithmic biases, opacity, discrimination, exclusion, and inequality, as matters of political economy related to data ownership and the loss of control over data and regimes of intellectual property that are actually tied to the appropriation and the financialization practices of digital capitalism. And this includes competitive advantages of corporations, like big tech seeking global market monopolies. And the focus in this area, I didn't move to the next one yet, but the focus in this area, I just want to highlight one thing here, because this literature also has some gaps, right? Because the focus has been on the impact of technology and data practices on several economic registers, such as labor and the formation and the reconfiguration or reorganization of markets, and the impact of AI in inequality and distribution of power and wealth in society, and looking also at the platform economy and innovation practices. However, Most of this work focused on the global north and lacks an adequate understanding of the theoretical and empirical specificities of the margins, like places in Africa where the technology is currently being deployed in terms of AI diffusion practices. And despite actually the growing technology innovation ecosystem in Africa. And in particular, there is the work of, like Caldry and Mahias in data colonialism, the cost of connection. This work is interesting because while it's being picked up by decolonial scholars and critical data studies and science and technology studies scholars, but it's very much rooted in the political economy analysis of datafication processes and practices around data. So if you go next. So looking through the work of contemporary African studies scholars gives us a perspective from which to look at AI from Africa. So contemporary African studies scholars attempt to expand the conception of Blackness under new conditions of globalization and domination of powerful Silicon Valley tech giants on the global economy. And these scholars argue that the Black condition, scholars like Membi, for instance, they argue that the Black condition has become something of a global one that is embedded in the different ways contemporary global capitalism operates within many spheres, including, the digital itself. And they argue that these conditions of inequality, alienation, and marginalization have intensified in both Euro-America and the global South. And basically, there is an argument that global capitalism is moving into two directions, increasing the exploitation of large parts of the world. And we see that even with the rise of, intensification of mining operations for rare earth metals that are used in a lot of the emerging tech, but also it moves in the direction of increasing the rate of innovation and invention. And from this point of view, the nationalization of data collection can be understood as a commercially motivated form of extraction that advances particular economic and governance interest. So, for example, some of this literature look at data practices in digital platforms and AI as being formed by characteristics of European modernity, such as absolute universal rationality and its logic for universal data extraction and the management of human beings through data. And scholars like Membi and Sabello Gaccini argue for the need for epistemological decolonization, which is in essence resist AI data colonialism. So from this perspective, contemporary African studies attempts to do in two intellectual moves. So the first one is to shift the project of theory making south by looking at contemporary practices in the peripheries. And in this sense, it argues that the margins are also engaged in creative articulations of different modernities and technoscientific formations from below. So later, when I talk about the case study, we'll look at some of the examples in terms of where this is happening. If you go to the next slide. The second move, it tries to emphasize, and this is something seems to be lost in a lot of the decolonization scholarship. So there is an emphasis that decolonization in Africa was understood as a transfer of power from the metropolis to former colonial positions, and referring to the complete overthrow of colonial structures, institutions, and ideas of Western modernity in post-independence Africa. However, there are some gaps in this literature, and mainly it lacks the engagement with the scientists and practitioners from these globally marginalized epistemic communities in Africa that are actually engaged in AI development, about their visions and understanding of the deployment of AI technology in Africa. And this is one of the areas I guess some of my work is trying to basically complement. So if we go to the next slide. So the case study that I'll be looking at, it's basically a multi-sited ethnographic case study where I conducted around 40 semi-structured interviews that included policymakers, scientists, tech practitioners, engineers, and entrepreneurs. And I also did participant observation in a number of settings, including conferences, workshops, seminars, and even meetings within some of the tech startup companies that I've interacted with. And I looked at, a number of documents and policy proposals to basically enrich my data. The case study actually focuses on AI development within international development following the deployment of a program called AI for Africa. And this program is funded by the International Development and Research Center, which is the Canadian government agency for international development. And this map kind of shows, the deployment of this program across the continent. This program has three pillars: AI capacity building, AI innovation, and AI policy. And if you go to the next one. And there are also a number of other, funders involved in this area of AI for development in Africa, because there is a growing transactional interest by a lot of nations, including, like beside Canada, including Sweden, Germany, the UK, US, and China as well. And sometimes there is a lot of collaboration, especially between European funders like GIZ, SIDA, and the Canadian one, IDRC. So if you go to the next one. So the findings for my investigation into this case study suggest, if you go, sorry, to the next one, suggests that, the AI innovation ecosystem in Africa is actually configured by discourses and practices of international development, multinational corporations like big techs, Meta, Google, and a number of other ones, and Western philanthropic foundations, like the Bill Gates Foundations and a number of other ones as well. And the stated aims of these efforts are actually to build capacity for AI research and innovation in Africa and enable the African AI community to contribute locally and globally to the development of responsible and ethical AI. There is an emphasis in a lot of these programs on the ethical dimensions of AI when it comes to its deployment in the continent. However, the deployment of responsible AI in Africa, as I said earlier, underpinned by deficit logic that frames the lack of the African context in AI. And this is where a lot of the discourses actually focuses. There is a lack of African context in AI as the main barrier for the uptake of AI technology in Africa, and for AI technology to actually address some of the longest standing social and economic issues in the continent. And this deficit model is built around the lack of African innovations and the lack of African data sets that can actually inform local AI applications and solutions. And it also draws on discourses of decolonizing AI. And I will talk a little bit about that. So, for example, we see that these narratives and efforts are pushed by global bodies such as the OECD, which is currently championing the efforts around the global deployment of responsible AI. And the main drivers behind these efforts are the global push for the UN SDGs and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is a new vision put forward by the World Economic Forum that promotes emerging technologies such as AI, Internet of Things, blockchain, and so forth to power economic development globally. However, the framing of responsible AI around this deficit logic denies Africa the participation in the creation and development of the technology out of the gate, and excludes African AI communities from AI innovation and actually from the imaginations around what an AI technology looks like from Africa. And this is one of the main arguments here. So the politics of this deficit logic allows also international actors to influence the development of AI ecosystem and the ideas around what kind of solutions are actually best suited for the local context, including, different economic development models and social transformation programs. So if you go next. So yeah. so the first idea that is actually related to the lack of African context in AI, it's related to the lack of African AI innovations that are actually rooted in the local context and has the potential to compete at the global scale. Similar to Chinese companies and innovations, which for companies like Alibaba and ANT, for instance, which created new markets at the global stage. So if you go next, this is a code that actually shows some of these discourses from some of the interviews, right? And, like here, in this code, like one of the entrepreneurs in like was working on this area in agri in developing AI models for like for a smart agriculture, talks about the fact that they need to come up with their own solutions, and they don't need to wait for for the I guess global tech companies to come and present solutions for them. And while this code actually describes this lack of African innovation, it highlights two aspects. The first one is around some of the dynamics associated with the exclusion of the globally marginalized communities from dominant Western epistemic communities engaged in the production and the deployment of AI technologies. The other aspect is he also articulated this in the context of decolonizing AI, while foregrounding a particular understanding of what decolonization mean in this context, which is pretty much rooted in technological sovereignty. So if you go to the next one, the second idea refers to the lack of African data sets that can inform AI research and technological development in the continent. So if you go next, there is a quote here that I would like just to show briefly. And in this one here, the example that's given, like from another, practitioner who is working in also in this area of like farming and smart farming in Africa, in terms of the lack of, of the data, right? And this issue actually highlights some of the barriers of innovation in AI in the continent, specifically around data practices that excludes those globally marginalized communities from AI innovation prerequisites, right? Because a lot of the data sets, as you mentioned here, are basically collated in the West. So if you go next, um, so this is a comparison map that basically shows, I guess, or compare the deficit model, because the deficit model is also used in the West as well. It's not only just limited to Africa. So we see that the West. In the West, actually, the deficit model is built around public participation in technoscience and innovation, while in Africa, it's about the lack of African context in AI. And the stakes are in the economic development in the West, while the stakes are framed around global inequalities in the global South. And the controversies are around social justice in the West, while the focus has been in Africa in histories of coloniality. And the policy focus is in commercialization and market development in the West, while we see the focus in Africa has been in capacity building and modernization. And the ecosystem obviously is configured by national government investments in the West in research and development, and also like big involvement from the private from the private sector as well. While we see that in Africa here, this is pretty much like configured basically by international assistance. So if you go next. um, So considering that the main issue highlighted by researchers and practitioners is the lack of African perspectives in AI development as one of the major concerns for the AI uptake in the continent, the current discourse in responsible AI, especially in the global south and particularly in Africa, puts forward the notion of decolonizing AI as the solution to this problem. And decoloniality, as many of you know, argue that practices and legacies of European colonialism are still experienced in contemporary societies, and that those forms of social discrimination have outlived formal colonialism. And the notion of decolonizing AI looks at computing as inherently colonial practice that is influenced by existing economic inequalities, and even global structure and institutional powers and colonial relations and epistemologies that outlived colonialism and continue to persist and inform contemporary computing practices, including those of AI. However, the accounts of many of my interlocutors actually destabilize the way the notion of decolonization has been mobilized in the field of AI in the African context. While they acknowledge the importance of decolonization in addressing issues of structural injustices, they present an alternative approach by looking at decolonization as a technical practice. And this includes processes of transformative adaptation of technology into the local context, or reverse engineering, and different approaches to innovation, such as frugal innovation, generated by local grassroots organization. One notable example of this is a project to develop low resource computing to respond to the historical challenges around infrastructure in Africa. And in their view, the general discontent with the way decolonization has been mobilized in AI in the continent stems from a few issues that they raised during the interviews. So from their point of view, confining the debates on innovation to colonization does not adequately reflect the realities of what is happening in the ground in terms of emerging innovations in the local context. And additionally, also, it does not respond to the issues of adaptability of AI knowledge in the local context. So if you go next. In another way, the current discourse of AI ethics has a few shortcomings. So obviously, it doesn't really problematize the historical origins of ideas such as, ethics and intelligence. But there is also very little discussion about what kind of futures these ethical frameworks or decolonial frameworks are attempting to decolonize AI are trying to imagine, and the performativity of their underlying political visions. So in another way, there is a lack of engagement with the political imaginations of AI communities in the continent. Nevertheless, these discussions are being mobilized in the field and are informing, like policy proposals and ideas. But we also know from a lot of literature, especially in science and technology studies, that policies don't get replicated easily between geographies because they are very much tied and influenced by the imagination of every nation about the future and how social order ought to be in that particular place. So if you go next. So given, I guess this, one of the questions that basically arises here is how should African researchers and policymakers approach the question concerning responsible AI in the development agenda? And I look at this question by actually presenting two contrasting ideas of Pan-Africanism, technological development, and AI that are basically emerged out of the research. So the first vision, it's basically put forward by the African Union in its strategy for science, technology, and innovation for 2024 as part of its agenda 2063 for economic development and social transformation in the continent. And the 2063 agenda puts forward an overarching vision of an African Renaissance, which is a shift from a focus on anti-colonial struggle to inclusive social and economic development in a globalized world. So there is an emphasis on the global dimensions here. And the African Union 2063 agenda also demonstrates this vision through the institutionalization of number of initiatives, such as, Smart Africa, also the establishment of the African Data Science Project to support the UN SDGs and targets. However, according to local actors that I interviewed, they see that the AU or the African Union ideas rely only on techno-scientific and commercial rationales that are actually aimed at attracting international development funding and financial investments from multinational corporations by adhering to Western conceptions and logic of social progress and economic competitiveness in a globalized world system. And by doing this, it gives more agency to international actors in shaping the development agenda in Africa. If you go next. The other ideas are put forward by members of civil society and the local AI communities in the continent. And their ideas actually envision an alternative development path by looking at AI development in the continent as a Pan-African project about technological sovereignty and reclaiming the development agenda in Africa. Their project foregrounds African communal ideas and philosophies, such as Ubuntu, which recognizes the person as a person that exists through the community. And some of the notable differences between the two approaches, for example, is around the approach to data governance in Africa, between conceptions of data as a private resource governed by laws of intellectual property rights and ready for commercial exploitation by private interests, versus data as a communal resource that is actually part of the commons, and its benefits should be distributed across the community. So in essence, these two imaginaries of development represent two contrasting ideas of economic and social transformation in building the modern African state using technoscience and innovation. And many of the local advocates of AI in the continent highlight the absent role of the state in building AI national strategies and governance frameworks that actually prioritize the interests of the local population in this development and centers the political imaginations of the different AI communities in the policy discourse. So if you go next. So what are the stakes here, right? So and these are a couple of quotes basically from some of the interviews as well. The first one talks about the fact that there is this sense of being left behind or left out of this like AI revolution, right? And there is a push for actually ensuring that Africa is part of this revolution, but in a very ethical way. And the second one talks about the fact that Africa is always also kind of like failing behind, missing in some of the earlier industrial revolutions. But we need, and with this new force industrial revolution, there is also a risk of also falling behind again or missing out on this. So these two quotes actually and the scores the risk of falling behind as well as the risk of being exploited as well, right? Hence, the emphasis on some of the ethical dimensions. So if you go next. So from a theoretical perspective, these research findings suggest that one way of understanding AI in Africa that can help us refine our understanding of the role of technoscience and innovation is to understand the decolonization of AI as a socio-technical imaginary in the African context. And we see that like AI for D has become a site for controversies around global and local inequalities in the continent, where different ideas of responsible and inclusive AI are being framed and contested by local actors. Local AI advocates are also raising concerns that AI development and the growth in the tech startup ecosystem might not be aligned with the local priorities or offer leapfrogging ideas, as some puts it, but simply copying the advanced economies in the Western world. And state and non-state actors have deployed civic epistemology, such as the modernization of traditional sectors, to bring closure to some of these debates by nationalizing the ideas and practices around sustainable development goals in Africa, with the focus on capacity building and the main policy discourse, such as Smart Africa and some of the other programs. While many of these visions seems to be concerned with the colonial legacy of the continent and the histories of marginalization of Africa, the global economy, they also attempt to recast Africa as an equal contributor of AI, signaling actually a shift towards a globalized perspective in AI 4D and inequality discourse in the continent. So what are the implications for AI governance and technoscience innovation and policy in the continent when we look at these discourses of decolonization as a socio-technical imaginer? Can you go next? Um, so looking through the analytical lens of socio-technical imaginers into these AI controversies in the continent, it actually allows us to situate these different visions within the larger national debate about the state building in the continent and the different contested views of what does a modern African state look like from an African perspective, and to what degree these processes of globalization are actually shaping these conceptions while recognizing that state building as a post-colonial project in Africa continues to be an unfinished project. Therefore, AI for development projects are not just about AI and innovation, but they are equally about what kinds of futures Africans demands out of AI technology in the continent. And this is something that requires institutional building that is not only able to support the development of AI, but also capable of bringing the different visions and contested ideas about what it means to do AI from a particular community in Africa. And these perspectives will allow us to actually recenter the futures of indigenous, Black, and underrepresented and marginalized social groups in the policy discourse. So, on the AI innovation front, um, this understanding of innovation practices through the analytical lens of also racial and colonial technoscience and their impact on the political economies of AI in the margins is very critical to understanding how the innovation story of AI fit in a continent that actually attempts to fashion its own African futures with these new emerging technologies. So go to the last one. And so, in summary, what I try to argue for, is that governing AI requires proper engagement with the political dimensions of technological development and needs to center the political imaginations of the various marginalized communities in Africa at the center of AI governance discourse. And the question of AI governance in Africa and more broadly the global South is in fact a question about the different visions of desired futures and the political imaginations that actually sustain these visions with science, technology, and innovation. And thinking through my argument that responsible AI in Africa is underpinned by a deficit model in development, it underscores how AI innovation actually excludes marginalized countries, nations, and communities in ways that not only bar their participation in the reception of AI, but also as being part and parcel of its innovation creation, meaning from the imagination of the technology itself. And my argument underscores two important dimensions for AI innovation policy: the need for understanding computing as a racialized practice while incorporating political economy of techno science analysis to think through the conditions that actually allow certain technology to be produced, practiced, sustained, and more specifically governed in the continent. And I guess I will leave it here, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yousif, for that lovely presentation. I'm just going to maybe try to give people a bit of time to, to process that and prepare their questions and comments. And so while I give people time, maybe I just, try and capture some of what I, really appreciated about your presentation. And so, I mean, I find this account really helpful um, in two senses. One, it's a really comprehensive mapping of the different um, networks of actors engaged in um, the pursuit of development and development goals through artificial intelligence, the different funders, different initiatives, different applications of AI. And I guess also more, I think what really struck me again is that at least my sense of what you're doing is a kind of critical discourse analysis of, in this case, of the different futures that are being contested by by a variety of different actors, states, regional blocs like the African Union, international development organizations, civil society actors. And I mean, you and I have had this chat before, but part of why at the Ethics Lab we're very interested in your work is that it teases out the implications of ideas about Africa for ethics. So there are a variety of ways in which we talk about Africa, which have implications for the kinds of things we place emphasis on when it comes to thinking about ethics, whether that's through the language of sustainability, responsibility, etc. And so, this idea of Africa as a place of scarcity naturally features in your critical assessment in terms of the deficit model that sort of that informs how we think about artificial intelligence and development in Africa. And so frames the priorities, right? It's about getting low-cost technologies to as diverse a population as possible without, in this case, really grappling with the future world that we want to build and who gets to participate in that. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I'm sure we're going to have I'd like to invite people to, if you've got a question, maybe just raise your hand, and when you're recognized, you can take off your mic, so you can put on your video and come ask your question, or you can also put your question in the chat as well. I'm just going through now to see if there's any. Yeah, we've got a question from Jess and Bashir. So I'm going to suggest you can ask your question, and then after that, Bashir can ask, and then we can get an initial response and take another round of questions.
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really enjoyed the presentation. It was very compelling on lots of levels. I guess listening to this and listening to other similar talks, I'm often struck by the kind of question like, why would it be any different? Like when we look at the origins of artificial intelligence and the ways in which it's driven from the kind of Silicon Valley perspective, the biographies of the people who've been designing it, combined with the kind of political moment where you've got your Elon Musks endorsing Trump and Peter Thiel, the kind of effective altruism, sort of, I don't know what you would even call that, but that sort of neo something kind of desire to try to kind of consolidate the position of the minority world. I sometimes just wonder, why are we surprised? Like, this is just the latest manifestation of a series of technologies that have been defining the world order for centuries. And that, rightly or wrongly, Africa gets caught up in, as does the rest of the world. But for me, the issue is with the founders and originators of these technologies who certainly don't have any desire to change the world system because they're looking to preserve it and particularly to preserve it in an era of climate collapse. So I agree with everything that you've said, but my only thing is like, okay, so why are we surprised and what do we do with that lack of surprise going forward? And is there a way that we can somehow reframe the conversation so that we're not kind of surprised anymore? I don't know if that question makes sense, but thank you very much for the intervention.
Thanks for that, Jess. Bashir, and then Yantina, and then we can get some initial responses from Yousif before taking another round of questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very good presentation, Yousif. And I really appreciate that very much, and I think I need some time to digest that for some time, But my first concern and issue about the question of the intersectionality in terms of to what extent that AI will help us and will enhance our understanding to the to the root causes of the issues, like poverty, like violations of human rights, and I think we need really question of identity and rights, issues like that. I'm not sure that whether this tool will really help us in future in that, this one thing. The other things you have already mentioned about the social cultural aspect, which I find it interesting, and particularly the African perspective, and particularly the African languages, in terms to what extent that AI will I mean the framework, the general framework will help us, or this is something which as African we have to develop and improve, in terms of the using our own language, local languages, to add to development in general. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you, Bashir. And Yantina?
Oh, I'm nodding. Yes, excellent. Sorry, that just always takes a while. Thank you, Yousif. That was really lovely and very thought-provoking. I think that there's a sense, and I think Bashir and Jess touched on that too, which is, and Asikinge Kamga, Karen has posted in the chat saying, well, what do we do next? And so I find that question always very tantalizing, very thought-provoking. And so I do like the idea of social technical imaginaries, and I've been playing around in my own mind a little bit with utopias. In the EthicsLab, we speak about another world as necessary, and what that looks like, and how ethics is a tool to help us manifest that. But what do we do, I think, is often the question that I end up with, especially, and I mean, Jess touched on this too, in a space where the dire cost, right? The technologies are owned. We're going to buy a license to ChatGPT because it's the most powerful technology. Is it really possible for us to reimagine, not just reimagine, but reenact, claim these technologies in a way that allows us to do different things? So that's maybe a comment or a question or a theme that is, I think, running across these different contributions. I wondered if in your comments, if you can say a bit more about what you understand a Pan-African technoscience to be, and what the intellectual opportunities are for that work, what the themes are that would. So what is a Pan-African technoscience? It's the third time in a week that I've come across that reminder that is important. What does that look like for you?
All right. Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Jess, Bashir, and Benita, I guess, for, like these questions. These are very important questions. I'll try to address them, perhaps maybe, just, by talking across the board, I guess, to answer, all of them, because I think there's a lot of different threads that we can actually try to deconstruct here, right? So I guess, like, for the surprising aspect, I'm not really sure if we're really surprised, right? Like, I think I would agree with you, Jess, that this is probably something, like, expected. I think, for the longest time, with every new emerging technology, every new technological advancements, or any technology that's been hyped for various reasons, like economically and socially, we see those two narratives of, the technology is going to change everything. And especially in the African context, like, this discourse is not new. And actually, my work is trying to show that the discourses around AI for development are very similar to the old narratives around ICT for development, right? So in a way, this AI for D is actually a subset. The way that I look at it is a subset of the previous incarnation of, like, AI, like ICT for development, right? Which is being criticized, like, a lot, right? But I think as scholars, and especially as critical scholars, we need to still critique these kinds of initiatives, right? And we need to study them. We need to show that they're basically where they're like falling short. Um, the power struggle within these, right? Because I think there is definitely a power dimension here that also needs to be deconstructed and and explained. There is another thing as well. I think there is a lot of critical scholarship that's actually happening in the global north around this development as well, right? So there is a lot of discourse around issues of algorithmic discrimination and so forth, right? But I think one of the things that I'm trying to do also with this work is to show that there are also forms of implementation of this technology in the global south that are also worthy of studying, right? And we need to study them and we need to critique them as well, because also the way that this deployment is manifesting itself in the global south is different. It's different from the is different from the north. And there is a lot of different scholars also in other I guess geographical locations, like for instance in Latin America, who has been trying to do similar work in the Latin American context, right? Which brings me to, I guess, a point that Bashir mentioned around intersectionality, right? And this is something that I didn't get a chance to actually talk about it in this presentation, but basically, I and somewhere else I've written around some of the differences between, these critical perspectives, because intersectionality is really rooted in a lot of the civil rights movements in the US, right? And we see a lot of the intersectionality frameworks being used in a lot of the critical literature in the global north, right? So the work of, like Sophia Noble and Rua Benjamin and a number of other, critical scholars. What I'm trying to say here is basically that if we're looking at this from a racial analysis perspective and from a decolonial perspective, that decolonial project in Africa was actually very much rooted in the political sovereignty and the economic sovereignty of the continent, right? And I think we need to bring the discourses around how we can decolonize AI in the Africa to those kinds of visions, right? Because it's pretty much, like around those, which also brings me to, I guess, some of the, other points that Bashir mentioned around, for instance, African languages, right? So African languages, um, there have been, and I'm doing some work currently actually on African languages, inspired by the work of Gugi in Tiango, in terms of his critique for the loss of memory when we're talking about the marginalization of African languages, right? And when you look at the political economy of that, you see that actually there is very little interest from the big tech companies actually in pushing, African language models, for instance, right? Like in a lot of the technological development. I've done some field work, talked to some people who are actually engaged with that work in the continent. Some of them is startups, and they talked about some of the I guess lack of support that they found from a lot of these places. But I think for us as African scholars, I think we need to also understand why we need to engage in this development of African language models, right? And I think, to me, it goes back to the original issue around decolonization, because the original project around decolonization in Africa, as I mentioned earlier, part of that complete overhaul of the colonial structures is actually to go back to African language. And there have been efforts, a lot of them failed in so many different African countries, in terms of using the local languages in administration, in education. There are a lot of efforts that went into, I guess, trying to overhaul the education system, even, and being, taught in the local language. So to me, the issue is around the loss of memory, and it's really a political project that we need to push. But I don't know if we can really rely on some of the big techs. In terms of what do we do, because this is something that actually came up many times during, like the comments and the questions. Obviously, I don't really have a conclusive answer right now, but I have maybe some ideas or some thoughts in terms of, how we should really be thinking about this, right? So as I mentioned earlier, I think there is still a need for us to continue the critical perspective, and point out the very fact that, yes, this is actually not really something completely new, and it actually follows a continuum of, particular, I guess, economic and political domination. But I think also we need to build, to me at least, the answer is around building a social movement around this, right? I think without the political pressure, right, that we can actually come from the grassroots and building, a social movement around actually, this new emerging technology, AI, given, all the hype around it. I think without that social movement, I think there will be very little chance for us to actually, impact this, right? The other thing as well I would say here, is that what I'm also trying to do with my critical perspective is not only just to show that, the this technological development right now is just a continuation of, of a history of domination and exploitation and, and extractivism in the continent, but also to show and give voice to a lot of other alternative projects that are also happening, in the global south and in Africa. There is a lot of social groups and social, and civil society organizations who are engaged in alternative ideas for this, and obviously their work doesn't get featured as much. And so I think we have a responsibility as scholars as well to examine that work and, and bring lights to it. And I hope that comes across a little bit, although like I'm very critical, but I think also, there is some other work that's also worthy of, lifting up, I think, in the continent, and I think we need to recognize that. In terms of, like the Pan-African, technoscience project, to me, I think it really goes back to the original ideas around Pan-Africanism, like Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah and like a bunch of other, really, like similar scholars on Pan-Africanism. And Pan-Africanism was a movement that really, expanded from the Caribbean to, like the Americas to basically Africa, right? And I think a lot of it really centers around this political project of economic and technological sovereignty. So that's the way that I try to basically, I guess, understand the Pan-African, like project. Obviously, in the practical level, that requires more, like national, like independent national strategies, cooperation between different countries, like regional cooperation and regional organizations. But it really needs to be rooted or, like centered around this idea of technological and economic, sovereignty, right? And earlier, protagonists of African independence tried to do this in so many different ways, doing African socialism as one of the approaches that was basically, was very, prominent in the 60s, which, we all know it didn't really, produce a lot of results in the continent. But nevertheless, I think this is a political project, and this is work that, especially with the support of a social movement around, like, around tech and, and science innovation in the continent, perhaps we can actually have more productive, discussion around what this project actually looks like in the 21st century, and not just leave it to the African Union to define that, right? Because the African Union also defines that in their documents. But when you look at it, it's very ironic because they quote Nkrumah, who coined neocolonialism, but they are still pretty much, attached this project to the world, like world system economics, right? So I think that's, that's how I understand it. So I hope this, kind of, I guess, answers some of the questions that you guys had.
Thanks, Yousif, for that. Yeah, I think you gave each question enough attention. I mean, I'm opening up the floor to more questions, but while they come, just to consolidate this question again on, what's the program of action? So I hear you saying that, yes, it's not, these critical perspectives are not new, but we need to continue with them. I hear you acknowledging some opportunities to uh, ins- um, mobilize artificial intelligence in the rehabilitation of African languages. Here you're talking about building social movements, and maybe that's something that's worthy of further elaboration. But there's also a question in the chat room about opportunities for public engagement, which I think is really important, particularly because, you're talking about marginalized epistemic communities excluded from being involved in, thinking about desirable futures, but also now the admittance that, this is not just something for the AU to decide or for international development organizations to decide. So I think that's a question from Katrina Matheson about well, specifically opportunities for public engagement, but I guess to your point, how do you get more diverse? What can we do to get more diverse communities involved, or how do we foster an inclusive sense of ownership in terms of who gets to participate? Yeah, how do you democratize these conversations? I think, to put it simply.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Thanks, Katrina, for that. Obviously, there is definitely a need for, public participation in these, in these discussions, because as I tried to show in the presentation, there is an underlying, political question here, right? Like around, social order, around, economic development, right? And these are all things that requires public participation, particularly in Africa. Obviously, it's not easy to do because, there is a lot of issues around, democratic participation, in terms of how, the institutional infrastructure as well that can actually support those kinds of discussions to be fruitful and have, I guess, like an impactful outcome, right? So these are some of the challenges that I guess we see, particularly in the, in the continent. But I think, it is part of the, I guess, the struggle for a lot of the people who are actually, trying to, I guess, bring voices like forward, like around some of these visions and ideas. And I think we need to create, perhaps, and this is one of the things that I'm trying to do, and I know a number of other scholars in the continent are trying to do, is to try to create like alternative spaces, right, where, these different groups can actually convene and have different discussions, right? I remember actually when I first started looking at this project, and this perhaps like maybe a couple of years ago, there was a lot of resistance actually from international funders and donors to actually engage with the governments, with the local governments, and also with the private sector, and mainly because the idea was to create spaces for, civil society to actually have greater participation, right? Obviously, I can tell you that vision has changed over the last couple of years. I see more and more now private public private partnerships that actually involves international donors with some of the national governments, with some of the big tech companies. I mean, a good example of that is the Lacuna Fund. I think is one of the things that I had it in one of the slides. She's basically a fund for developing, for data collection, basically for a lot of African, I guess, applications, and is supported by, you know, Meta and a bunch of other funders from international, you know, for international development. So I think, you know, obviously it seems to me like, you know, the political train has shifted a little bit there in terms of, you know, the priorities. But again, this is part of what I was saying earlier, that we can't necessarily really rely completely on international assistance programs. Like, we need to figure out ways to actually create our own spaces where we can actually have these kinds of, you know, these kinds of discussion, which hopefully that can lead to basically, you know, like a broader movement. I mean, there is a lot of work that's been happening in Kenya right now in terms of, you know, around the data protection laws, right? And, you know, and different civil society groups are kind of coming together in terms of critiquing and improving of that kind of work. And I think there is a lot of focus right now in the continent in terms of data protection laws as well. Like, there is so many different initiatives, and I think this might be a good opportunity also for scholars who are working in different countries to find ways to actually create spaces that can bring more people, you know, from different perspectives, so they can actually be part of that conversations or that discussion, right? So so that's one part. The other part, which is basically, you know, related to policy as well, right? So I think we need to continue, I guess, our policy and advocacy work. And that's work that requires, you know, I guess, political strategy and political coalition, and you know, and bringing different groups to actually have conversations with policymakers. Because I think also policy, you know, is still, I think it's an effective or an important tool of actually intervening in this development, that I don't think we should actually ignore it. I know some critical scholars might lose faith on the policy as an instrument for intervention, and focus pretty much on, you know, on local grassroots organizations, which is, we need that. But I guess, like, what I'm trying to say here is, it's very important that we still continue to find ways to actually see how we can actually intervene in the policy making process, right? And understanding that's actually also a political endeavor.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Yousif. Do we have any other questions? Anyone raising their hands or in the chat room? I guess while I wait for that, I do have a question myself. You know, I was, you know, what I hear you clearly articulating, and maybe I just want to link it again to this trend of what should we do, and, you know, your recent concluding point about also the opportunities that exist in the policy space. If the framing here of the project, of the political project, a political project that's informed by anti-colonial and anti-imperial histories, like in concepts like decolonization or pan-Africanization. So I heard you, and, you know, very clearly say it's about technological sovereignty. Well, at least the project historically was about economic and political sovereignty. And in this digital age, in this AI age, it's transformed into a necessity of technological sovereignty. And so the question, therefore, is maybe what is your understanding of technological sovereignty, and what are the policy opportunities to pursue, or what are the opportunities to pursue technological sovereignty through policy work?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, no, this is a very good question. And actually, there is a lot of ideas and conceptions around technological sovereignty, and also, we can also say, data sovereignty as well. There is a lot of ideas that actually comes from indigenous, like scholars and social groups, actually, in places where settler colonialism is still present, like in the US and Canada and Australia and a lot of places. And there have been, like, for instance, one of the very talked about cases is the Maori data sovereignty protocol that they enacted, like in the Maori territories, right? And basically, they literally took ownership of the data in terms of, the data collection process, in terms of the storage of the data, in terms of dissemination of the data, right? So to me, that's an instance of, of technological sovereignty, for instance, and a successful one that is still developing, but it's very much informed by basically, I guess, settler colonialism and their location and their, and their context, right? There are other, similar projects as well, like in Latin America, for instance. Google is building, like data centers in so many different places. There have been a focus on Chile, for instance, right, to build one of those data centers. There was a lot of resistance against building that. And there was a lot of engagement from grassroots groups in the, like in the country, that basically resulted, like right now the project is on hold. But they managed to get basically the municipality where the data center was actually going to be built to actually have more ownership in terms of, even some of the technological aspects of it, in terms of like the cooling system and stuff like that, but also intervene in the ways that the data center will actually be used in terms of data storage, right? And the kinds of regulation, if it's going to be in their particular community. So I guess taking some of these examples back, and trying to apply, that in the continent. I think one of the important ideas is to basically think about how national governments can actually have more ownership of large technological infrastructures, right? So I think that would be one of the very important, I guess, tasks that we need to think about it, right? And that's why I think detaching some of those, I guess, national innovation strategies from international development becomes very important, because then it gives local governments more power to actually, I guess, dictate, some of the ways in which some of those projects could actually happen, right? So I think that's very important. Obviously, as we know, and like in somewhere else, I wrote about this as well, where the national governments or national states in Africa are still not really taking this as seriously as they should, right? And it's still very much being viewed as a way for attracting more, like loans and funding from international development, as part of, I guess, closing some of the gaps in some of the budget deficits in some countries. So in a lot of ways, these kinds of projects are very often funded by, the World Bank, or some of the other organizations. So I think we need to rethink the way that we're actually engaged in building this infrastructure, right? And they will be a push for actually building more and more infrastructure in the continent, right? Because capitalism needs to expand and needs new market and needs new consumers, and it's going to continue to expand. And we all know right now there is a scramble for Africa, right? Like in terms of AI and in terms of data, right? It's called the new scramble, right? For Africa. So I think this is an opportunity for for local governments and also activists and local advocates, right? To basically look for ways to see how some of these new initiatives can actually be really informed by um, I guess like more governance models that are actually from from below, and think about technological sovereignty in terms of owning some of these infrastructures, or actually even having a bigger stake and dictating how they actually manifest themselves. I think there is definitely, I mean, it's not a fair comparison to say like the EU was able to somehow put some of those laws, like the GDPR and some of the other ones, in terms of how some of the big tech companies can actually I guess like engage in some of these projects in the European continent, right? Although some of these data centers are not technically like in Europe, but I guess through regulations, right, the operation of those in the continent is still considered as part of the jurisdiction of those, right? And I think we need to somehow figure out ways to do similar things. And I do believe that eventually we will have the economic power to actually be able to do this. We always had it, right? Like, but it's just the problem is we lacked, I guess, the political project that can actually really make that a really effective tool like for us, right? So I think that's something that we need to continue to think about it. And like around AI and emerging technologies is just another frontier for for trying to do that. I
All right.
think you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Yousif. So there's two questions in the chat room that I'm going to read out. So Mary asks, do we have guidelines that have been developed for the use of this technologies? Mary, I don't know if you maybe want to give some more clarity to that.
Mhm.
And then Zoe observes that the more I work with researchers in this field, the more I realize that there are two quite distinct communities: those advancing fundamental AI research and those leveraging AI in their various areas of impact, development, or applied research. These communities do seem to have quite different priorities, needs, and perspectives, and the gap is quite often large. Do you have any advice for working productively across these research communities or disciplines? Which I think is an important question, given that that's part of what you're calling for as well, right? In terms of
Yeah.
an inclusive democratic conversation in this sort of futuring or world-making project. So, I mean, do you want to take those two questions? Does
Yeah.
any need more clarity?
Okay, yeah. So I guess, yeah, no, thank you so much for the two questions, Mary and Zoe. So I think if I understand Mary's question correctly, in terms of, you mean like ethical guidelines for developing responsible AI in the continent? Um,
Uh,
if that's,
Can
sorry.
I
Yeah,
can I
yeah,
briefly
yeah. Go ahead then.
clarify? I'm looking at the complexity that you've been talking about. So many questions. All these questions are going to come to go to ethics committees to be answered. So do we have any research guidelines that have been developed to do some capacity building? Because I'm sure very few on, ethics committees know about how to go about reviewing studies that involve this new emerging thing. There's an issue of data sharing, something like that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. No, now I understand it. Yeah, so I think this is an ongoing work. So, and I mean, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, It's still pretty much championed also by some initiatives actually from some of the international development funders, right? There is some work that's been done in, let's say, for instance, the Responsible AI Ethics Lab in Ghana, in Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. There is some work by ACTS, the African Center for Technology Studies, like in Nairobi, and there is a bunch of different initiatives. One of the observations that I have is, and this actually came even in some of the interviews, a lot of people who are actually, like actively engaged in developing some of these guidelines, they still prefer to, I guess, like inform a lot of their work by some of the ethical frameworks or guidelines that are developed in the West. And it's actually very funny because there is still also like a big challenge even in the West. I mean, if you look at the US, for instance, the US doesn't really have any, any national or, or federal like regulations, right, like for this new technology, and they're actually struggling, right? There have been a lot of proposals that get stalled in Congress, and nothing is happening. And and if you're following the debates there, you will see the struggle, like in the US, right? Even in Canada, there is some initiatives, but some of these are still also struggling in terms of updating some of the existing laws. The ones that really made some progress is in the European Union, and also Brazil has a really good initiative that was actually successful and passed in parliament, and it was pretty much informed by, I guess, the local context and some of the histories around decolonial scholarship in actually like in Brazil, right? So I think Brazil could be also like a really good, a good example. But I think also in Africa there is work that's been happening, right? And some of this work is also championed by legal scholars who are looking at some of the fundamental questions in terms of even the questions of rights, because for instance, a lot of these frameworks looks at rights in terms of individual rights as being understood in a lot of like in Western I guess culture and conceptions, and also human rights as well, right? Which is, there's a big critique for human rights as being like a colonial project in itself, right? But perhaps maybe we don't have the time to actually talk about that, but that's actually one of the big critiques. So there is some work in terms of trying to come up with different conceptions that are based on like African ideas and African philosophies in terms of the idea of basically rights and freedom from an African perspective, right? And that could actually influence and inform some of the regulations around things like data protection, for instance, and privacy, right? Especially around the concept of privacy. If you email me or put your email, maybe I can send out some of that literature. Obviously, it's not as visible, but it's making progress, and there is a lot of conversations that are happening around that. So I think there is a recognition that a lot of these frameworks are actually influenced from the West, and we need to think about different ways in terms of how we think about these questions in the local context. In terms of I guess the second question. Okay, yeah. So about the different communities, right? Okay. So yeah, I that observation is correct. There are two distinct communities, maybe even a little bit more than two, in terms of the engagement on this AI development, because some of it is really fundamental research and tries to advances, I guess, the science, and some of it is really applied research, right? I think one of the I still find resistance in actually both groups to actually include social scientists as part of their research conceptualization, right? So some places and some universities are better than others in this regard, but I think if we push the idea of the importance of having social scientists asking some of the important questions about the social impacts around whether the research or even the innovation that some of the practitioners are working on. I think that will improve some of the collaboration between the two communities, because actually when you really think about it, you will find that there will be a lot of overlapping, at least from a, from a social inquiry perspective or social sciences inquiry. There will be a lot of I guess overlap between some of these questions that could be originated from, just pure scientific research to, applied innovations and, and applied and applications in the continent, right? So I think that's one of the to me, I think that's one of the ways that we can actually improve that, if we can push for more, for centering, I guess, the social sciences inquiry in in the research agenda on both groups, right? And that might actually form the link between the two. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much, Yousif. I'm very aware that we're running over time, so I'm going to try to see if I can bring this to a close.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think there's an appetite, there's a hunger for more learning and resources around this topic, as many in the chat are demonstrating. So, thanks for offering to email resources to people, and some have put their contact information in the chat room. And also thanks to Melissa for
Yes.
providing some account of some of the work that is happening in the UCT University of Cape Town's ethics space. And so those will remain in the chat room. There's also someone's asking if your slides are going to be made available. I mean, that's your decision, Yousif. But also just to say that.
Yeah, sorry, I can share
No,
the slide. Yeah, finish. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Just to say that, I mean, you do have a paper about whether AI can fix development in Africa, which I'm sharing the link to that in the chat room, the piece you wrote on Bot Populi, but also to say that to others interested in keeping tabs on the EthicsLab and these kinds of conversations, we will be blogging about this, and so I will be reaching out to Yousif about in the process of writing that blog, any resources that he's willing to share about further learning in these conversations as well. So please do look out for that. So it's posted in the chat room. And yeah, Yousif, you're about to say what you're happy to share.
Yeah, so basically, so I'm happy to share the slides, but I also want to point out, I mean, that this work or this lecture is part of also like a book chapter that is coming out soon with the same title actually. From the Oxford University Press, and the book is the Handbook of the Sociology of Machine Learning. It's an edited volume, so I have a chapter there, and I think I'll try to share. I'll send you the link to it's forthcoming, but you can view the online, you can view the online version of the chapter, and it encompasses a lot of the stuff that I talked about, and like an even more, right? So yeah, and yeah. So I
Excellent.
think
No,
that's something I'll yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Yeah, and we hope to see you all at our next events. So yeah, thank you, Yousif, and yeah,
All
thank you,
right.
everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a
Yeah,
good
thank you so
afternoon.
much. Yeah, thanks everyone. Really enjoyed the conversation. All right.
Excellent.